The city of Zorath was alive with noise, but it was not the sound of joy. It was the sound of chains dragging on stone, the cries of the weak, the sharp voices of alien masters. Above the markets, great ships floated like hungry birds waiting. To snatch prey, the air smelled of smoke, rust, and fear. In the middle of this cruel world, there was a girl. She did not have a name anymore. The masters never cared to call her by one. She was only known as a personal slave, a body to serve, a shadow with no future. Her wrists carried deep scars from years of iron cuffs. Her eyes were tired, but in the corner of those eyes lived something else, something that refused to die, a tiny spark hidden waiting. She had been sold many times before, passed from one hand to another like broken furniture. Now she stood in the slave market, silent and still. Crowds of aliens and humans walked past her, some laughing, some bargaining. She had learned not to speak, not to look up, not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope meant pain. She stood like stone, but inside she asked the same question again and again. Will this ever end? The market itself was a place of horror. Cages filled with people lined the walls. Children cried for mothers who could not answer. Men stared at the ground, their spirits already broken. The traders shouted prices as if they were selling cattle or metal, not human lives. The air was thick with cruelty, and yet the world kept moving. No one cared, except one man. He stood at the edge of the market, poor and unnoticed. His clothes were simple, worn by years of labor. His face was marked by hunger, but his eyes burned with something different. Unlike the others, he did not see slaves, he saw people. When his gaze fell on the girl, he felt a weight in his chest. She looked lifeless, yet her silence was louder than any cry. It called to him like a whisper. Help me. The man's name was Kale. He was not a soldier, not a hero, not a rich merchant. He was just a worker who had lost almost everything. But even with nothing, he still carried one thing inside him, courage. And in his pocket, he carried one single coin. That was all he had left, the last piece of value in his world, a coin that could buy him food for one day or perhaps safety for one night. But he had carried it for another reason, not to survive, but to use when the right moment came. And now as he watched the girl in chains, he felt the moment was here. The slave trader shouted her price. The crowd laughed, mocking the idea that such a weak girl could be worth anything. Her skin was pale from hunger, her hands thin from endless labor. No one wanted her. No one cared. But Kale stepped forward, his voice shaking but clear. I will pay, he said. The crowd turned, surprised to see such a poor man speak. The trader smirked. And what will you pay with, beggar? Kale opened his hand, showing the last coin shining weakly in the dim light. Gasps spread through the crowd. A single coin for a slave. It was foolish, insane, laughable. The trader laughed. Is this a joke? But Kale did not move. His eyes locked on the girl. I will pay, he repeated, stronger this time. The girl lifted her head for the first time in days. Her eyes met his, confused, searching. Why would anyone spend their last coin for her? Why would a stranger fight for someone who was nothing? She wanted to look away, but she could not. For the first time, she felt something stir in her chest. A tiny thread of hope. Hope she had long buried under years of pain. The trader looked at Kale, then at the crowd. He enjoyed the mockery. He enjoyed the game. Finally, he shrugged. Fine, beggar, she's yours, take her. The chains were unlocked. The iron cuffs fell to the ground with a heavy sound. The girl's wrists bled where the metal had bitten her skin. She stepped forward, weak and trembling. Kale reached out his hand, but she hesitated. Freedom was strange. Freedom was frightening. Yet something in his eyes told her he was different. The crowd still laughed as Kale led her away. To them it was a foolish act, a waste of a coin. But to her, it was something more. Her life had changed in one moment, and though she did not yet understand why, she knew this man had risked everything for her. And that was the beginning of a story greater than either of them could imagine. The streets of Zorath were colder than stone. and every shadow carried danger. Cale walked with the girl by his side, the weight of silence heavy between them. The crowd had already forgotten them, but the moment still echoed inside her heart. For years she had been chained, beaten, ordered, and now suddenly she was free. But freedom did not feel like a gift. It felt like a trap she did not understand. Her steps were unsteady, her wrists still raw from the iron cuffs. She wanted to speak, to ask who this man was, why he had done such a thing. But her voice caught in her throat, for she had learned that words often brought punishment. Cale glanced at her, his eyes steady but tired. "You are free now," he said softly. "No one owns you anymore." She looked at him with disbelief, for she had heard lies before. Freedom was a word many whispered but few had ever touched. Still, there was something in his tone, something that made her chest tighten. Cale led her through narrow streets until they reached a small shelter. It was barely more than 4 walls and a roof of rusted steel. Inside was only a wooden bed, a cracked table, and a lantern dim with age. To a free man, it was nothing. To her, it was everything. No guards, no chains, no orders, only space where she could breathe. She sat on the floor, curling her knees to her chest, still watching him with careful eyes. Why had he done this? Why would anyone waste their last coin for her? Cale moved slowly, placing the lantern on the table. "I had only 1 coin left," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "It could have bought me food, or a night of rest, but it would not have bought me peace." He turned toward her, his eyes shining in the weak light. "You were more valuable than that coin because you are human, not a thing." Her breath caught, for no one had spoken to her this way in years. She wanted to believe him, yet fear pulled at her heart. Every kindness she had once trusted had turned into pain. But Cale's words felt different, like a seed planted in dry soil. For the first time, she tried to remember who she once was. Long ago, she had a name, a family, a place to call home. But the years of chains had taken those memories, grinding them into dust. Now all she had was emptiness, and a stranger who called her free. She whispered, her voice cracked and thin. "Why me?" Cale did not answer at once. He sat by the table, folding his rough hands. "Because if no one starts," he said finally, "then nothing will ever change." His words settled in the room like quiet fire. She had heard many voices in her life, harsh voices, cruel voices, but never one like his. The night grew darker, and the sounds of the city outside grew sharper. Drunken laughter, alien shouts, boots striking the stone roads. She shivered, for she knew freedom was fragile. The alien masters did not forgive rebellion, even a small act like hers. Somewhere, someone was already angry that she had been freed. Cale noticed her fear and spoke again. "You do not need to be afraid here." But she did not believe him. Danger always found the weak. Hours passed, and she lay on the wooden bed, staring at the roof. Sleep did not come. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he want from her? Why did his eyes look both kind and broken? She remembered the weight of his coin, small yet powerful. That single coin had done what no army had done. It had broken her chains. She touched her wrists, feeling the open skin, and for the first time in years she cried. Not from pain, but from something she did not recognize. Relief. Cale, sitting quietly near the lantern, watched her without speaking. He knew she did not trust him yet, and maybe she never would. But he had seen her eyes in the market, and he knew there was strength inside her. He had spent his last coin not for pity, but because he believed in that hidden spark. And though he was poor, weaker than most, he believed that sometimes one small act could change everything. Outside, the streets whispered with rumors. Word of a slave bought for a single coin spread fast. Some laughed, calling Cale a fool. Others whispered in secret corners. If one man could free a slave with only a coin, what else could happen? The alien masters, however, did not laugh. They saw danger in every small flame. One free slave could become many, and many could become a rebellion. Already, silent hunters began searching, watching, following. Kale and the girl did not know it yet, but their story had already become larger than themselves. The girl closed her eyes at last, her tears drying on her cheeks. Her heart was still, afraid, still chained by memory, but deep inside a question formed, quiet and new. What if this man was right? What if her life could be more than chains, and what if a single coin could really change the world? The girl opened her eyes slowly, confused at the silence around her. There were no orders shouted, no chains rattling, no guards striking the ground with iron boots. Only the sound of a city waking up beyond thin walls. For a moment she wondered if she was dreaming, but the marks on her wrists reminded her it was real. Kale was already awake, sitting by the table, staring at the small lantern as if lost in thought. His face looked older in the daylight, lined with struggle, yet steady. When he noticed her watching, he gave a small nod, almost like a greeting. "You slept?" he said gently. "That is good." She turned her eyes away, unsure how to answer. In her old life, speaking to masters was dangerous, silence was safer. Even now, though he claimed she was free, the habit of fear chained her tongue. Kale stood and placed a bowl on the table, a thin broth made from roots and water. It was poor food, barely enough for survival, yet he set it before her with care. She hesitated, staring at the steam rising from the bowl. No one had ever given her food without demand, without price. She picked it up slowly, sipping. With trembling hands, it was bitter, but warmth spread through her chest. She whispered, almost to herself, "Why are you doing this?" Kale sat across from her, his eyes calm. "Because you deserve more than chains." The words hit her like a storm she did not understand. She had been told for years that she was nothing, less than nothing. Yet this man spoke as if she mattered, as if she was worth more than the coin he had given away. Her heart did not know whether to trust or to run. Still, for the first time in many years, she felt the smallest seed of safety. Outside, the city moved as always, but shadows were beginning to stir. The alien masters had heard whispers of the freed slave. They wanted her back, not because she was valuable, but because freedom itself was dangerous. If one slave walked free, others might begin to dream of the same. So hunters were sent into the streets, quiet and cruel, searching for the girl and the fool who freed her. Inside the shelter, Kale tried to make her speak. He asked simple questions. "What do you remember? Do you have a name?" She shook her head slowly, her voice almost gone. Not anymore. Names had been taken from her long ago, burned away by years of servitude. Kyle leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Then you will have one again, one that belongs only to you." She blinked at him, confused, afraid, but a spark lit in her chest at the thought. It was a strange thing to imagine being someone instead of something. The day passed in silence, broken only by the noise outside the walls. Kale worked with tools, repairing broken scraps of metal, trying to earn a little food. The girl watched him, studying the way he moved, steady but weary. He had no riches, no power, no army, only a heart that refused to bend. She wondered what kind of man would spend his last coin on a stranger, and she wondered what fate waited for both of them now. At night, as darkness swallowed the streets, the city changed. The sounds of laughter and trade were replaced by boots and whispers. Hunters moved like wolves, searching houses, asking questions. The girl woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps outside the door. Her breath froze, fear rushing back like an old enemy. Kale raised a hand, telling her to stay quiet, his eyes sharp and focused. The door shook once, then twice. But the footsteps moved away. Still, she trembled, her heart racing with memories of chains. Kale placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and steady. "You are safe," he whispered. But she knew safety was only an illusion. That night, she could not sleep again. She sat near the lantern, watching. The small flame burn. Kale finally spoke, his voice soft. "I had a family once. The masters took them." The girl turned, her eyes wide. He continued. "That coin was the last piece I kept, a reminder of who I lost." He looked at her, his voice heavy. I gave it away because I will not let them take everything, not again. Her heart clenched not from pity, but from something deeper. For the first time she felt his pain mixing with hers. Two broken lives sitting in a broken house, yet somehow holding on. Outside, whispers of rebellion began to spread. A story of a man who freed a slave with a single coin traveled from mouth to mouth. It sounded foolish to many, but to others it sounded like hope. Hope that even small acts could light a fire against chains. The girl did not know it yet, but her fragile beginning was also the beginning of something greater, something that would shake the city, and perhaps the stars themselves. She lay down again, her body weary but her heart restless. For the first time in many years, she closed her eyes not as a slave, but as someone who might have a tomorrow. And, as sleep finally pulled her into silence, one thought whispered inside her mind. Maybe freedom is real. Maybe this man is not a fool. Maybe my story is not over. The city of Zorath did not forgive rebellion. Every chain was counted. Every slave was marked. Every whisper of freedom was hunted. When word spread that a girl had been bought for only a coin and then released, the masters grew restless. To them it was not about one life. It was about control. If a single chain could break, then all chains could break. And so the hunters were sent into the alleys and streets, searching for the girl and the man who had dared to challenge the order. Cale and the girl lived quietly in his broken shelter, but silence could not hide the storm that was building outside. The girl still had no name, only a shadow of one lost long ago. She moved like a ghost inside the house, always listening for footsteps. Her fear was heavy like a cloak she could not remove. But Cale watched her with steady eyes, and in his gaze she saw something she had not known before. Patience. He did not demand her trust. He waited for it, like a seed waiting for rain. At night, Cale listened to the city, the sound of soldiers marching in rhythm, the sharp calls of hunters moving door to door. Every day the danger grew closer, yet he did not bend. He told her, "They are looking for us, but we will not run, not unless we must." She shook her head in disbelief. "They will kill you." But Cale's voice was calm. "Better to fight with purpose than live on my knees." The girl's chest tightened at his words, for she had lived her whole life on her knees. She did not know what it felt like to stand one night. The shelter shook with the sound of boots. Hunters passed through the street, their torches spilling red light across the walls. The girl pressed herself against the bed, trembling, her heart racing. Kyle stood at the door, holding nothing but a broken piece of iron. The hunters paused, speaking in harsh alien voices. They marked the door with a symbol of warning and moved on. The girl whispered, "They will come back." Kyle nodded. "Then we will be ready." But ready for what, she wondered. She had no weapon, no strength, no plan, only scars and fear. Yet Cale looked at her as if she carried something powerful inside her. She hated that look, and yet a small part of her wanted to believe it was true. Days passed, and Cale began to ask her about the places she once served. Slowly, with broken words, she told him of the alien palaces. She had seen hidden doors, secret tunnels, and the careless routines of her masters. She remembered how they guarded their weapons, but ignored the small cracks in their fortress. Kyle listened carefully, nodding, his mind turning these fragments into something more. He was not a soldier, but he understood that even giants could fall if struck in the right place. The girl watched him, her fear fighting against curiosity. "What are you planning?" she asked one night. Cale looked at her with steady eyes. "To do more than just hide." Her heart raced at his words, for she had never imagined such a thing. Slaves did not plan. Slaves did not fight. Slaves only obeyed. But here was a man who owned nothing, yet spoke as if he could change everything. She wanted to tell him he was mad, yet a small voice inside whispered, "What if he is right?" Outside, the masters began to spread lies. They told the people that Cale was a thief, that the girl was dangerous. They promised rewards to anyone who revealed their hiding place. Neighbors grew suspicious, eyes lingered too long on Kyle's door. The girl felt the net tightening, every step outside heavier with risk. Still, Kyle did not waver, he told her. Fear is how they keep us chained even without iron. She heard the truth in his words, though her heart still shook. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Kale placed a small object on the table. It was a crude weapon, built from scrap metal and old tools. The girl stared at it, confused and afraid. "What do you expect me to do with this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Kyle looked at her, not with anger but with quiet strength. "Hold it, even if your hand shakes, because one day you will need it." She wanted to throw it away, to scream that she was no warrior, but her hand closed around the weapon anyway, trembling but firm, and for the first time she felt the weight of something other than chains. That night when she lay awake, she thought of her past. She remembered the endless halls of the alien palace, the cruel laughter of her masters. But she also remembered their arrogance, their blindness, their belief that slaves could never rise. Perhaps Kale was not a fool after all. Perhaps weakness could be turned into strength. Perhaps even a broken slave could become something more. The city grew darker as the hunt continued. Kale and the girl became shadows themselves, slipping through alleys, gathering scraps, listening to whispers. Every step carried danger, but every step also carried a new feeling, the start of defiance. She did not understand it yet, but she could feel it. Her fragile trust in Kale was growing, shaping into something she could not yet name. And though the hunters searched and the masters tightened their grip, a fire had already been lit, small and hidden, but alive. And sometimes the smallest fire could burn down the largest chain. The nights of Zorath grew sharper with fear. The Tide masters had doubled their patrols. Hunters walked the streets with torches that burned like cruel suns. Every alley was watched. Every whisper was tracked. Every shadow was suspected, and yet inside Kale's small shelter something new was beginning to grow. It was not fear. It was not silence. It was the slow birth of defiance. The girl still had no name, but she had something she had not carried. Before, a weapon, crude and heavy, forged from scraps in Kale's tired hands. At first she hated the sight of it, hated what it meant. But each time she touched it, she remembered the chains, the lashes, the laughter of masters who believed she was nothing. The weight in her hand became a reminder that she was no longer only a slave. Kale watched her as she practiced holding it, his face calm, his voice steady. "You are stronger than you think," he said. She shook her head, whispering, "I am nothing." But Kale answered, "That is what they want you to believe." Each day, Kale walked the streets, blending in as a poor worker, but his ears were sharp, and his eyes searched for more than food. He listened to rumors, studied guard routes, and learned when the alien supply ships landed at the edge of the city. The masters thought the people too broken to resist. But Kyle saw something different in their silence. Not loyalty, but hunger, for hope, for change, for fire. One evening, Kale returned with urgency in his steps. He placed a small map on the table, drawn with charcoal on torn cloth. "This is where they keep the supply ship," he whispered. The girl stared at him, her heart pounding. "What do you plan to do?" His eyes met hers, unshaken. "We will strike it, just once, to show them they are not untouchable." Her breath caught, fear rising like a wave. "To fight them is death," she said, but Kale shook his head. "To never fight them is slavery forever." The night of the strike came cold and silent. The city was drowned in shadows, only the hunters' torches burned. Kale led her through hidden paths she had once seen as a servant. Tunnels beneath broken walls, alleys too narrow for soldiers to follow. Her memory, once her curse, was now their guide. Her heart pounded with each step, every sound of boots in the distance making her flinch, but Kale's hand at her back steadied her, reminding her that she was no longer alone. When they reached the edge of the landing bay, the ship stood like a monster of metal. Its lights glowed, its engines hummed, and crates of weapons and food lined the ground. Alien guards laughed, careless, their arrogance blind to the danger creeping in. Kale crouched low, whispering, "This is not about destroying them. It is about showing others we can fight. The girl's hands trembled around her weapon, but she nodded. For the first time, she felt the fire inside her burn hotter than her fear. They moved like shadows, silent and small. Kyle lit a small flame and pressed it to a jar of stolen. First, the girl's heart raced as the light flickered in his eyes. In that moment, she understood. This was more than one act. This was a spark. The flame touched the crates, and fire spread like a hungry beast. It licked the wood, swallowed the fuel, and climbed into the night sky. The guards shouted in shock, their laughter turning into panic. Kale grabbed her hand, pulling her into the tunnels as the fire roared. Behind them, the ship burned, and with it the silence of the slaves. By dawn, the story had spread. A supply ship had been destroyed, the masters humiliated, the hunters furious. Whispers ran through the markets, through the hidden rooms where slaves huddled. Someone fought back, they said. Someone struck, the masters. Fear mixed with hope, and for the first time in years the chains felt weaker. The masters tried to silence the rumors, but the fire had already moved faster than their lies. One act of defiance had turned into a symbol, a single flame lighting across the city. Back in the shelter, the girl sat by the lantern, her hands still trembling. She had not swung her weapon, she had not killed, but she had stood there, unchained, part of the fire. Her heart pounded with the memory of the flames, the sound of chaos, the rush of escape. Kyle placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. You see, even the smallest act can break their illusion. She looked at him, her eyes wide. They will come for us. Kale nodded. Yes, and others will watch, and others will remember. That night the girl dreamed not of chains but of fire. She dreamed of ships burning, of masters running, of voices shouting not in fear but in freedom. When she woke, she realized the fear was still there, but now it shared space with something else, something sharp, something alive. Hope. She whispered into the darkness as if to herself. Maybe I am more than nothing. Outside, the hunters doubled their search. Bounties were painted on the walls, Kale's face sketched in crude lines, the girl's shadow marked with threats. The masters swore they would find them, that no one could hide from their grasp. But the people of Zorath whispered a different story, not of fugitives but of sparks, and sparks had a way of turning into fire. The fire at the supply ship had changed everything. The city of Zorath buzzed with whispers, every corner alive with talk of rebellion. Some were afraid, some were angry, but many felt something they had not felt in years. Hope, yet hope always drew blood, and the masters would not forgive. They sent hunters through the streets offering gold for Kale's capture, threatening torture for those who hid him. Kale and the girl fled into the outer edges of the city. There were caves in the rocks beyond the markets, places too small and dark for soldiers to search. They carried little with them. Some dried food, a lantern, and their will to keep moving. The nights were colder there, the air wet with dripping stone, the silence broken only by distant echoes. But within that silence, something new began to grow. The girl sat by the lantern, hugging her knees, watching Kyle as he worked with scraps of metal. Every sound of his tools struck her heart in strange ways. Once men had only touched her life with cruelty, orders, and chains, but Kale's presence was steady, not demanding, not cruel, simply there. She found herself studying him, the lines of his face, the way he thought before speaking. She whispered softly, almost afraid of her own voice, "Why do you fight when you could hide?" Kale did not look up at once, his hands busy shaping a piece of iron. Finally, he said, "Because hiding keeps the chains alive, fighting weakens them." His words sank deep into her heart. She wondered how a man with nothing could think with such fire. She had seen lords with power, soldiers with weapons, and masters with gold. None of them carried the strength Kale held in his quiet hands, strength not of muscle, but of belief. As days passed in the cave, they began to share more. Kale told her of his past, of the family he had lost, of the coin he had held for years. His voice shook when he spoke of it, yet his eyes stayed bright. The girl listened, and for the first time she felt another's pain as if it were her own. In return, she began to speak of her years in chains. Her voice cracked as she remembered the palace halls, the endless commands, the silent screams. Kyle did not interrupt. He only listened, and that silence felt like comfort. One night, as the rain pounded against the rocks, the girl sat closer to him, her voice trembled. All my life, I was told I was nothing. Kale turned to her, his gaze steady. You are not nothing. The words were simple, but they broke something inside her. Tears slipped down her face, but they were not the tears of pain she had known before. They were tears of release, of wounds that finally began to heal. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them grew. It was not sudden, not a rush of passion, but a slow weaving of trust. She began to laugh softly at his small jokes, something she thought she had forgotten how to do. He began to smile when she spoke without fear. Together they cooked simple meals, patched their clothes, shared their memories. It was survival, but it was also something more. Something fragile, yet alive. One evening, as the lantern flickered low, Kale reached into his pocket. There was nothing there but his rough hand, empty, yet still offering. He looked at her with eyes that carried both strength and gentleness. I do not want you. As a servant, I do not want you as a slave, he said, his voice lowered, almost uncertain. I want you as my wife if you will have me. The girl froze, her heart racing. For years, men had spoken to her only with commands or cruelty, but Kale's words were not commands. They were a choice, a gift. Her lips trembled, her chest tight with feelings she had never known. She whispered, Why me? Kale's answer was simple. Because you are more than what they made you, and because I love you. The silence in the cave grew heavy, not with fear, but with something new. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time she did not hide them. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, she felt chosen, she felt human. Her voice broke as she whispered back, Yes. In that moment, the chains that had haunted her heart shattered more deeply than any fire could. But happiness is always tested in storms. As Kale touched her hand, footsteps echoed through the cave mouth. Sharp voices, harsh and inhuman, bounced off the stone walls. The hunters had found them, their torches burning against the night. The girl's chest tightened, fear rushing back. But Kale's grip was firm. Stay behind me, he whispered, his voice steady. The hunters' shadows stretched across the stone as they entered, weapons raised. The fragile piece of the cave shattered in an instant. Love had bloomed, but now it would be tested in fire and blood. The cave was dark, but the hunters' torches burned like fire against stone. Their shadows stretched across the walls, long and sharp, like claws reaching for prey. The girl's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the cold rock. Her weapon trembled in her hands, every part of her body screaming to run. But Kale stood tall, his shoulders straight, his grip steady on the iron rod he carried. He looked back at her once, his eyes calm, even as death closed in. Stay close, he whispered. We fight together. The hunters stepped forward, their alien voices hissing through the cave. Give up the slave, one growled, and you may live. Kale's voice cut through the air, strong and unshaken. She is no slave, he said, and I will not give her to you. The hunters laughed, their cruel faces twisting in mockery. To them, he was just a poor man, broken and weak. But Kale did not see weakness. He saw only the chains he had sworn to break. The first hunter lunged, his blade flashing in the firelight. Kale met him with the iron rod, the clash echoing like thunder. Sparks flew and the fight began. The girl froze for a moment, fear locking her limbs, but Kale's words rang in her memory. You are stronger than you think. Her hands gripped her weapon tighter, her breath heavy, her heart wild. When the second hunter moved toward Kale's back, she screamed and swung. The weapon cracked against armor, not strong enough to kill, but enough to stagger. For the first time, she had struck not as a slave, but as a fighter. The battle raged inside the cave, every sound of iron and roar of anger shaking the walls. Kyle fought with desperation, each blow fueled not by skill but by will. The girl fought beside him, her strikes clumsy, her body weak, but her spirit alive. Together, they stood against hunters who had never expected resistance. Blood spilled, torches fell, and shadows twisted. At last the hunters pulled back, hissing in rage, retreating into the night. But their retreat was not defeat. They would return, and they would not. Come alone, Cale leaned against the stone, his body bruised, his breath ragged. The girl dropped her weapon, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. "I fought," she whispered as if she could not believe the words herself. Kyle smiled weakly. "Yes, you did." Her chest ached, not from fear this time, but from pride, small and burning. But the moment of peace was short, for outside horns echoed across the valley. The masters were sending more, an army this time. They would not stop until Cale and the girl were dead, and yet the city had changed since the fire at the ship. The people of Zorath were listening, waiting, watching. When they saw torches gather at the edge of the cave, they followed, at first in silence, then in whispers, then in steps that grew louder. Slaves, workers, poor men and women who had lived in fear too long. They carried tools, stones, broken weapons, anything their hands could hold. For one act of defiance had lit something in their hearts, and now the spark was spreading. Cale and the girl stepped out of the cave together. Before them stood the master's soldiers, their armor gleaming, their blades sharp. Behind them gathered the people, frightened but unyielding. The girl looked at Cale, her eyes wide. "We cannot win." Cale's voice was steady, though his body trembled. No, not alone, but together. He raised his iron rod high, his voice rising with it. "They cannot chain us all," he shouted. "They cannot silence us forever." The words carried through the night, echoing across the stone. The people answered with cries that grew louder, stronger, alive. The master's soldiers charged, expecting the crowd to scatter. But for the first time, the crowd did not run. Stones flew, blades clashed, voices roared. The cave entrance turned into a battlefield. Cale fought at the front, his strikes heavy and desperate. The girl fought, beside him, no longer trembling, her heart alive with fire. She was not a slave, not a shadow. She was a warrior, a wife, a symbol. Every strike she made was a strike against the chains of her past. The battle raged until dawn, blood mixing with dust, fire burning across the valley. When the sun finally rose, the soldiers were broken, their lines shattered, their torches extinguished. The people of Zorath stood together, bruised and bleeding but unbowed. Cale leaned on his weapon, exhausted but alive. The girl stood beside him, her face pale, her body weary, yet her eyes brighter than ever before. She looked at the rising sun and whispered, "I am free." Kyle placed his hand in hers, his voice soft but strong. "Yes, and together, we will keep it that way." The people looked at them not as fugitives, not as outcasts, but as symbols. A man who had spent his last coin for freedom, a woman who had risen from chains to fight. Together, they had become the spark that would ignite a fire across the stars. For freedom was no longer a dream whispered in shadows. It was a flame burning in every heart, unstoppable, unending. And so their story, once about a coin and a slave, became the beginning of a revolution.